In the oracle to the Christian congregation or congregations in Pergamum, the glorified Christ speaks of Pergamum ominously as the location of the throne of Satan and the place where Satan dwells. Antagonism toward the Christian movement appears to have been particularly high there, resulting in the murder, whether as a result of official proceedings or back alley action, of a Christian named Antipas. An inner Christian movement seeking to make room for some degree of participation in their neighbors' idolatrous rites appears to have gained a foothold in that environment. Nothing at all is known of the origins of the Christian community there. It is possible that members of Paul's team or of the congregations he planted in Ephesus, 110 miles to the south of Pergamum, carried the gospel to other major cities in their province, as Epaphras had evangelized Colossae, Laodicea, and Hierapolis, but this is merely conjecture. A Jewish community, at least one of small to moderate size, appears to have existed in Pergamum and might have provided the seedbed for the fledgling church there, as so frequently in the Mediterranean diaspora. The evidence for this Jewish community's existence is almost entirely literary. Josephus preserves a decree of the city council of Pergamum in favor of the Jewish people, essentially acknowledging and pledging support for the stipulations laid down by Rome concerning the Jewish state in Judea under John Hyrcanus I, who was high priest and head of state from 134 to 104 BC. The decree is quite vague and mentions nothing about a Jewish presence in Pergamum itself, but it seems highly likely that the Judean embassy would only have stopped in Pergamum on its way home to Judea from its audience with the Roman Senate because there was a Jewish community in the city that they wished to visit. In 59 BC, the governor of Asia, L. Valerius Flaccus, was accused of misappropriating funds, including a large sum of money that had been collected by Jewish communities throughout the province for the purpose of supporting the Jerusalem temple, that is, the temple tax paid by adult male Jews throughout Israel and the diaspora. In the details of the charges, we learn that a small amount of the money in question had been appropriated from Jews in Pergamum, suggesting at least a small Jewish community resident in the city and its environs. Flaccus appears not to have been guilty of misappropriation after all. Rather, he was enforcing an earlier edict prohibiting the transport of gold out of the province. This, in turn, tells us something of the Jews of Asia Minor's devotion to the temple and to their fulfillment of their obligation that expressed their connection to the temple, since they were willing to defy a recent edict in order to continue their practice of collecting money to support the temple and its rites. Finally, we might mention one important 2nd century AD artifact that attests to a Jewish presence in Pergamum, a small altar or table bearing an inscription that seems most naturally to speak of the God of the Jews, quote, God, the Lord, the one who is forever. Zoperos dedicated the altar or table and the lampstand with the lamp to the Lord. The designation of God not with any known name of the Greek pantheon, but by the titles familiar from the Jewish scriptures. Lord, which appears frequently in the Jewish scriptures, the one who is, well known from Exodus 3:14, renders it highly likely that Zoperos was a devotee of the God of Israel, though his own ethnicity cannot be determined from his name. Pergamum and its surrounding territories had come under Roman rule as a result of Attalus III, the last monarch of the kingdom of Pergamum, giving his territory to Rome in his will in 133 BC. Pergamum was one of the chief cities of the Roman province of Asia, with Ephesus and Smyrna as its primary rivals. Its Acropolis dominated the city and the landscape, towering more than 1,000 feet above the surrounding plains. During the Hellenistic period, The city was largely confined to the hill of the Acropolis, although the residential areas moved increasingly and expansively into the valley below during the later Hellenistic and throughout the Roman periods. A siphon system brought water up from the rivers below to the Acropolis above. It was Pergamum that introduced this technology to Roman engineers who used it advantageously throughout the empire. One of the city's greatest claims to fame in the province was the honor of having been named Neokoros, or temple warden, of the provincial imperial cult in Asia for its construction and consecration of a temple to the worship of Augustus and the goddess Roma, the deified personification of Rome itself, in 19 BC. The construction itself had begun in 29 BC. Tiberius refers to this imperially authorized temple as the precedent he himself followed for accepting a proposed temple to himself, his mother Livia, and the Roman Senate in Smyrna 50 years later. Quoting Tiberius from Tacitus, "The divine Augustus did not forbid the institution of a temple to himself and to the city of Rome and Pergamum, and I view all his deeds and words as carrying the force of law." No archaeological remains of the temple have been positively identified. Its location in Pergamum is a matter of conjecture, though the agora at the foot of the Acropolis is suggested as a potential location. A resident of Pergamum named Telephus had written an extensive treatise on this famous temple in the 2nd century AD, but his work is also unfortunately lost to posterity. Coins, however, give us some sense of the edifice and its contents. Coins issued by the Provincial Council of Asia under Augustus, Claudius, and Domitian feature the facade of this temple and reveal something of its contents. It was apparently a temple with 4 columns supporting its front architrave, housing 2 cult images. I realize that the coin that I am showing here shows 6 columns. There is some discrepancy between the facades on these coins, between a 4-columned and a 6-columned facade. Augustus appears inside as a cult image alongside the goddess Roma, 2 cult images worshipped in the temple. Augustus stands in his military armor. Rome stands next to him, draped in a feminine toga, holding a cornucopia as a symbol of prosperity, and extending a victor's wreath over Augustus's head. As the seat of the provincial cult of Augustus, an association popularized on the currency of the province, this temple and its activity has been one candidate for the identification of the throne of Satan in Revelation 2:13. Smyrna would also win the title Neokoros for its temple to Tiberius, Livia, and the Senate in 26 AD, and Ephesus would finally win the title for the temple it consecrated to the Flavian emperors, Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian, in 89 AD. Ephesus appears to have been the first of these major cities to flaunt its recent acquisition of the title in civic inscriptions both within its municipality and abroad. The Pergamines, however, were very sensitive to their place in the pecking order among the cities of Asia, and so began to assert their more ancient honor in their own civic inscriptions. One such inscription in the ancient gymnasium in Pergamum, honoring the director of the facility, the gymnasiarch, identifies the city and its leaders as, quote, "the council and the people of the Pergamines, the first to be awarded the title of temple warden." Pergamum thus claimed preeminence over its rival for having been thus distinguished first in the province. The Pergamines were not content merely to have been first to win this honor. Shortly after Ephesus had won this title for its temple to Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian, Pergamum invested in an equally massive temple to Trajan, who ruled as emperor from 98 to 117 AD. This temple and its precincts were placed conspicuously at the center of the side of the Acropolis overlooking the city below, an artificial extension of the temple's platform, using the barrel vaulted arch technique found also in the substructure of the Temple of Domitian in Ephesus, allowed the new temple to jut out upon the artificial brow of the Acropolis. Set on a podium 10 feet high, with a footprint of 60 by 80 feet and rising to a height of 60 feet, the temple to Trajan towered above the worshippers and passers-by, a testimony to the city's enthusiasm for the emperor and estimation of his greatness. Its architrave was supported by 6 columns on each of its shorter sides and 10 on its longer sides. The temple sat in the midst of a courtyard of 220 by 170 feet and was surrounded by tall colonnaded porticos on 3 of its sides, with no colonnade obscuring the view of the temple from below. For its pledge and display of loyalty, the city was awarded the title of Neokoros a second time, and thus enjoyed renewed preeminence. Civic inscriptions bear witness to the city's pride. Its civic body began to refer to itself in inscriptions as the council and people of the Pergamines, twice awarded the Neokorat. Ephesus continued the competition after Trajan's death, building a temple consecrated to Trajan's successor Hadrian, who ruled from 117 to 138 AD. For its support of and loyalty to the emperor, Ephesus won its second Neokorat and began to name itself twice Neokoros in its civic inscriptions. The city fathers of Pergamum, however, did not relinquish their claim to preeminence in the province on the basis of having been awarded its second Neokorat first. Inscriptions found in the city's Asclepion speak of, quote, the people and council of the first to be twice named Neokoros, city of the Pergamines. This story of civic competition is recounted here in order to demonstrate how strong were the connections between civic identity and pride and support for the imperial cult. While this competition appears only to have begun in earnest during the reign of Domitian, specifically following the erection of Ephesus' temple in 89 AD, it attests to the growing investment of the local elites in the imperial cult and the relationship of imperial cult to a city's regional prominence at the very time that Christian witness against the legitimacy of imperial cult and resistance to participation was becoming sharper. Even if John would not have identified an imperial cult site as the throne of Satan, the conflict between the Pergamines and the Christians can certainly be attributed, in part at least, to their differing views of this particular cult. The cult of the emperor in Roma, however, was but one facet of religion in the city of Pergamum. Several traditional Greco-Roman gods were worshipped in splendid temples studding the Acropolis and spread throughout the city below. Many of the religious sites atop the Acropolis would have been prominently visible even from far away. In the 1st century, before the temple of Trajan was constructed, the altar of Zeus and the temple of Athena crowned the brow of the hill. The altar of Zeus, located on the southern crest of the Acropolis, was without a doubt the most distinctive and most prominently visible structure overlooking Pergamum. Construction was begun in the early to mid-2nd century BC under Eumenes II, possibly in connection with his victory over the invading Galatians. The massive throne-like altar complex resembled an open-air temple, complete with columned porticos surrounding its staircase and inner courtyards. The whole had a footprint of about 120 by 110 feet, and it rose to a height of 40 feet. The sacrificial altar proper sat within the inner courtyard, which was approached by a wide, grand staircase. The reconstructed monument now sits in the Pergamum Museum in Berlin. The altar was adorned with nearly 400 linear feet of carved friezes, its scenes carved about 7 feet high. The frieze around the structure's perimeter depicted the mythological battle between the Olympian gods and the giants, with Zeus and Athena prominently featured on the front side. An interior frieze told the story of Telephus, the mythic founder of Pergamum. An L-shaped agora or forum was set just below the precincts of the altar of Zeus. The identification of some of the buildings as warehouses makes it likely that this particular forum served as a commercial center in the old city. On a plateau just above the altar of Zeus sat the temple of Athena, originally constructed in the 4th century BC. The 40 by 70-foot temple itself appears to have had a double sanctuary, with the deities facing in opposite directions. As Zeus and Athena were both the protectors of Pergamum, it would make sense for Zeus to have been the second deity worshipped at this site. The temple itself was built close by the edge of the Acropolis, with a large courtyard extending away from the precipice. The sacred precincts were expanded with colonnaded porticos and an elegant gate called a propylon, bearing the inscription, King Eumenes to Athena, victory bearer. The false balcony of this gateway was decorated with reliefs of shields and weaponry, probably representing the weapons of the defeated Gauls in Galatia, as this was the major threat during Eumenes II's time. The facades both of the temple and the propylon have been re-erected in the Berlin Museum, along with a cult statue of Athena. Eumenes II also established a library adjacent to the sacred precincts of Athena. If the library did indeed contain 200,000 scrolls at one point, as was boasted, a good portion of these would have had to have been stored someplace other than the 5 rooms of the library complex itself. That certain ancient kings took special pride in possessing indeed in possessing the greatest libraries, is exemplified in the rivalry of Ptolemy II, the king of Egypt and patron of the great library of Alexandria, and Eumenes II. Upon learning of Eumenes' ambition, Ptolemy significantly curtailed the exporting of papyrus. This is reputed to have led, in turn, to the invention of parchment in Pergamum, a writing medium made from the scraped skins of goats, and the development of the codex. Pergamum itself became a major exporter of parchment thereafter. The connection between parchment and Pergamum is seen more clearly in its Latin name, Pergamena, parchment, Pergamena. A great theater was built into the steep hill southwest of the Athena temple. Indeed, this is the steepest theater in the province of Asia. It was begun in the 3rd century BC and eventually renovated and expanded during the Roman period to accommodate 10,000 spectators in 80 rows of benches. A pathway leading north-northwest from the stage area of the great theater led to a temple of Dionysus, appropriately linked to the activities of the theater. The performance of Greek tragedies and the worship of Dionysus were often connected, as in the greater Dionysiac festival in Athens, in honor of which Sophocles, Aeschylus, and Euripides wrote their famous plays, including Oedipus the King, Agamemnon, and the Bacchae. The temple, itself about 40 by 65 feet, sat atop a podium fitted with a tall staircase of 25 steps. Following the main road down from the upper toward the lower Acropolis, one passes a Hellenistic period bathhouse and exercise area, and further down, a complex consisting of a small Roman bath, an Odeon, a small music and lecture hall, and an opulent cult room honoring a Pergamene named Diodorus Pasparus in the 1st century BC. One also passes some oil, grain, and wine processing centers and shops. One does not have to travel far, however, before coming to another complex of major cultic sites. On a large shelf halfway down the southern slope of the Acropolis sit the expansive precincts of the temple of Demeter, the goddess of abundance, especially of an abundant harvest. The complex as a whole occupies a space of about 125 by 250 feet. It featured stadium seating along the northern side of the courtyard, sufficient to accommodate about 800 worshippers. The altar proper, about 25 by 8 feet, sits in the middle of the precinct with the remains of the sanctuary of the goddess behind it. The altar was adorned with sacrificial scenes, such as a relief of a priestess of Demeter standing between torches beside the altar, preparing to sacrifice a bull to the goddess. One major difference between ancient temples and modern religious practice is that the worshippers tended to gather respectfully outside the house of the god, with the rituals and sacrifices conducted on an altar in front of the god's house. A modest cult hall dedicated to Dionysus stood a short distance beyond the temple of Demeter. Its most distinctive feature is its dining room. The overgrowth makes it difficult to see, but there are cement ledges all around the perimeter, suitable to be fitted with cushions to serve sizable gatherings of devotees or private diners, whose host might rent the space for his or her functions. The ledge that is visible around the perimeter would have been the serving area where food and drink was placed. Further east sat a temple of Hera, the wife of Zeus. An inscription found in the place shows this temple to have been built by Attalus II, the second to last of the kings of the kingdom of Pergamum. Building it atop a platform approached by 12 steps helped to make the smallish temple more impressive. The Temple of Hera overlooked the grand gymnasium and bath complex of Pergamum, the first iteration of which was constructed under Eumenes II, but which continued to be expanded and modified throughout the Roman period. Because of the nature of the landscape, the complex featured a three-tiered plan. The uppermost tier housed the principal facilities: the sprawling palaestra, a courtyard where all the principal exercises and combat sports were practiced, and two bath complexes. The palaestra was surrounded by colonnaded porticos on at least 3 of its sides, which was in turn surrounded by halls that could be put to various uses, including educational purposes. The complex was furnished with a 1,000-seat Odeon in its northwest corner and a small temple to Asclepius. The bath complexes followed the typical course of the Roman bath, including cold pools, warm pools, saunas, and rooms for massages and cleansing one's skin with olive oil and a good scraping with strigils. A second, lower tier offered a running track for the younger teenage boys. The third and lowest tier was allocated for children, including an exercise area and classroom spaces. A temple to Hermes and Heracles, the patron gods of the gymnasium and athletics in general, no doubt because of their representation of speed and strength, respectively, was part of the middle gymnasium complex. Another agora, or forum, of about 120 by 200 feet, surrounded by the customary 4-columned porticos, was constructed below and south of the gymnasium as part of Eumenes II's expansion of the city. Eumenes also created a new perimeter of defensive fortifications around his expanded city. The principal access point, the Gate of Eumenes, was located just west of this forum. The entryway was guarded from above by soldiers stationed on 3 towers. One other monument merits mention, namely the Serapeion, now called the Red Hall, located about 500 yards south of the Acropolis. Built in the 2nd century AD under Hadrian, this massive temple was likely dedicated to the Egyptian deities Serapis Isis, and Harpocrates or Horus. The shrine had a footprint of approximately 200 by 80 feet and rose to a height of at least 60 feet, approached through a broad forecourt surrounded by columned porticos. Only the brick substructure remains. All the marble has long since been repurposed. Although built after Revelation was written, the construction of such a magnificent edifice to the Egyptian gods suggests a devotee base that had already been growing in Pergamum for several decades. The chief point of interest for readers of Revelation is that one of the statues within this temple was found to have had an apparatus of piping that allowed a hidden priest to make it appear that the cult image could speak to its worshippers. John's vision of a local beast causing a cult image of the first beast to speak was not beyond the special effects technology of his time. Beginning in the Hellenistic period, but increasingly in the Roman period, the major residential areas of the city spread from the lower slopes of the hill into and across the valley beneath the Acropolis, all under the watchful eyes of the gods above, even as the modern city of Pergamum does today, sporting a population of 100,000, perhaps not far off from the population of the first century city. To the southeast of the Acropolis lie three principal public buildings from the Roman period: an amphitheater, one of the few in Anatolia, a stadium, and a theater, all making the public entertainments of the Roman period more accessible to the resident population. Further to the southeast of the Acropolis lies an Asclepion, a kind of religious healing resort dedicated to Asclepius, the son of Apollo and the god of medicine and healing, whose interventions would be sought in these sanctuaries. There were many such facilities in the ancient world, another celebrated one being located in Corinth. An 800-yard road lined with columned porticos led from the bottom of the Acropolis to the Asclepion, terminating in a small forecourt of about 60 feet squared, equipped with a central round altar, then opening into the sanctuary's main courtyard of about 400 by 300 feet, itself surrounded by wide columned porticos on the north, west, and south sides. Off the northwest corner of the courtyard stood a theater, capable of seating over 3,000 spectators. The southwest corner was furnished with spacious latrines. A library and a reading room stood in the northeast corner. The pavement of the main courtyard was interrupted by several small pools, no doubt for a variety of healing treatments. In the mid-2nd century, a temple to Asclepius was built along the east side. In the center of the courtyard was the entrance to a long tunnel running diagonally southeast into the circular abaton, the hospital proper, where patients would sleep in the hope that the god Asclepius would reveal or even effect a cure in a dream. The association of Asclepius with the serpent, found coiled about his staff, and as a result, a common decorative feature running throughout the Asclepion, has led a few scholars to associate this complex with the throne of Satan. In favor of such an identification might be the fact that Asclepius came to serve as the visual representation of the city itself on coins and in carved reliefs on inscriptions. For example, in this relief adorning an inscription celebrating the concord, the agreements worked out between Ephesus, represented by Artemis, Ephesia, and Pergamum, represented by Asclepius. Against the identification is the much closer parallel between the official imperial ideology of the rule of Jupiter, enacted through his agents, the emperors, and John's subversion of the same as the rebellion of Satan enacted through his agents, the beasts. Many scholars believe that John was speaking about the distinctive landmark, the altar of Zeus, when he said that Pergamum was home to Satan's throne. Jews were known to identify the pagan gods with demons, claiming that those who worshipped idols were really worshiping demons. You could find this in the book of Baruch, chapter 4, 6-7, as well as 1 Corinthians 10, 19-21. Of course, John himself uses this language in Revelation 9, 20-21. Identifying the Greeks' chief god, Zeus, with Satan, the chief of the demons, would have been a natural extension of this tendency. If John is thinking of a particular monument in Pergamum as Satan's throne, indeed a distinctive monument that would set Satan's throne in Pergamum, as opposed to one of the other 6 cities John addresses, the great altar of Zeus seems to me the likeliest candidate. In John's deconstruction of the official view that Rome and its emperors rule by the will of Jupiter or Zeus, and were destined by that chief of the gods to bring order, peace, and rule of law to the known world, John asserts that the dragon, who is Satan, stands behind that many-headed beast that exercises authority over the peoples, nations, and languages of the world, and that receives worship from its awestruck subjects. The temple of the goddess Roma and Augustus in Pergamum is a manifestation of the cult of the beast and its image, not of the dragon that gives the beast its power. Whether John had in mind the great altar of Zeus, the centers of the imperial cult, which he would describe as worship of the beast and its image, or the Acropolis as a whole, as a cluster of sacred sites that would be abhorrent to John, Pergamum would indeed have seemed to him a stronghold of Satan, perhaps the location of his very seat of power, as he deceived humanity to take what was due God and give it instead to sticks and stones and pretentious human rulers. The investment of the city in these cults, however, also explains why their inhabitants would not be disposed to tolerate a movement of people in their midst who claimed that all their temples, their sacrifices, and their piety was a sham, or worse. It is surely no coincidence that the theological program of the rival Christian teachers whom John labels Nicolaitans and identifies with Balaam, the historic prophet of compromise from Numbers 25 and 31, found a following among the Christians of this city. The pressure was indeed great to find a way to pay lip service to the gods of their neighbors while holding on to their private belief in one God and his Messiah. John rightly saw in Antipas, who was killed in some fashion because of his profession of one God to the exclusion of all others, the shape of things to come for Christians who refused to bow, as John saw it, before Satan's throne.